I thought he was giving off himbo energy at the start of this book.
Okay.
I thought he was going to be more like that throughout, but I do think later on in the book, after he's like lived more of his life and gone through some shit, he changes a little bit. He seems a little more self-aware and a little more emotionally like connected and aware of like the effect he has maybe on women. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But early on, I was getting like oh, I'm so good looking. Women all like me. I'm a little bit oblivious to it. I'm oblivious to this, to this woman, Alina, who's clearly into me, and I just can't I don't know. I was getting like maybe he's not super clever early on vibes, but he's just this like hot guy. But I think he grows past that. But that was my first impression with the character, at least.
I agree. Yeah.
Welcome, friends, to episode 179 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we're discussing Leigh Bardugo's 2012 novel, Shadow and Bone. So, James, which one of us is the Sun Summoner, and which one is the Darkling? That's my question.
Yeah. I don't want to spoil anything, but I do think that I relate more to the Sun Summoner. I don't know about you.
Okay. Yeah, no, I like that.
There's Darkling is an interesting character, mysterious.
Well, we talked about in our Good Omens coverage. I think you got to be the Dark Angel, and I was the Light. So
yeah, switch it up.
Maybe we'll switch it up this time. I'll be the wrapped in darkness one.
Yeah, we've been through a lot since then.
So yeah, we're reading Shadow and Bone this week. We read Shadow and Bone this week. Yeah, let's just start out in general. Like, what were your takeaways? Did you enjoy reading it?
I did. Yeah, I really enjoyed this the world building and everything in this world. I really liked the shadow fold. I thought was a really unique detail and like a fun like evil zone, and that was always looming throughout the story. It feels like a YA story in some of the facets, like some of the trappings of a YA novel are here. There's the romance.
Well, it is a YA novel, so.
Right.
Yeah,
the romance and some of the ways that this felt like a first in a series of novels, setting up like a larger world. Like it kind of feels like it just feels like we're getting like a small portion that was. Like it's gonna be hard not to draw comparison to like the YA novel that I read growing up, Harry Potter. So just to say,
is that the only YA novel you've read? Have you must have read some others? Right?
I absolutely have, but that was like the massive one. Like that was the one that was like very much in like that. Harry Potter was what turned me into a big reader as a kid. So like that's like a frame of reference for me. But it very much feels like a Sorcerer's Stone. It very much feels like something where you're getting a nice introduction to a new world. It's exciting. And then there's so much lurking on the outskirts that you're not given information on, or there's mysteries left unveiled and everything like that. So yeah, I enjoyed it as a first entry.
Cool. Tip of the iceberg, right? Like clearly there is so much more to this world. And like you said, we're only shown a little bit of it. And that's by design in some ways, and also she's continuing to write this series over the years and adding to it and adding layers, I'm sure. So I'm sure there are listeners who are well into the Grisha verse, have read his future novels, and are probably going to get frustrated with us a little bit if we're like we don't know what we're talking about. We've only read this one book. And this is our very first introduction. Neither of us had read this before. This is very new to us. So everything we're going to be talking about is based off of this book alone. So yeah, I guess keep that in mind. Also, like I want to talk a little bit about the YA category in fiction, and also like how I read this book. So I am writing a book that I am hoping will be a debut novel for me. It is not YA; it is adult sci-fi. I don't typically write in that category. However, when I was at my writing popular fiction program at Seton Hill University, I was writing a fantasy novel at the time, also adult. But because of that, I was sort of paired up with and teamed up with other fantasy writers in the program. And so I have actually read a lot of excerpts from, or even entire manuscripts of people who are writing what they hoped would be debut fantasy novels, some of which was either YA or borders on YA. And so because of that, I've actually read a lot of first manuscripts. And I went into this book with that background and knowing that this was a debut. And because of that, I also was able to pick up a lot of stuff that I would consider first novel issues that some people have. And I found it was very interesting to find some of them present in this book that was, obviously a big bestseller, successful novel, which always shows me like certain things. It's like, well, they tell you that this is super important, but then, how important is it? So anyway, I sort of read this book it through that lens of like trying to study it as a debut, as a piece of YA fiction, and as a piece of fantasy. And, through each of those sort of approaches, I was able to find different things.
Mm-hmm.
So the YA category has exploded in popularity in the last 10 years, but even before that, 20 years, it is incredibly popular to this day. It is a category that is designed for the age range of 12 to 18. Typically features protagonists in that age range. It tends to focus heavily on high emotional stakes and issues that would be appealing or interesting to teenage readers.
And relatable too, like things that they're going through.
Absolutely. Now, that does not mean that adults don't read it.
Right.
Obviously,
yeah.
Many adults read this category. I saw somewhere that 70% of all YA novels are purchased by people who are outside of that age category. However, many of them may be buying them for their teenage children. So it's hard to know exactly what the actual breakdown is of adults who are reading this, but there's definitely many who do. I think people are drawn to those clear emotional stakes, those identifiable, everybody went through this phase in their life where, romance was new, you're finding yourself. And I think people always enjoy stories. Many people, at least, will always enjoy stories set in that time of your life.
Yep.
And YA tends to be that. Now, everything I'm saying is not hard and fast rules. It's just generally.
Yeah. I know plenty of people who are well over that age that love YA. I know people who are of all age ranges who love YA. I like dipping into YA. It's not, when I was that age that you're talking about, I absolutely devoured YA novels. Like you're saying, I remember going to the library and just picking up all these series. And there's something very similar about a lot of them, and it's there are familiar things that you'll see in YA stories, but it's funny to me because some people almost see YA as this almost a guilty pleasure, and I don't even think it has to be seen through that lens though, because one thing that it reminds me of is in the anime community, there's a lot of people who will push back against shonen anime because they're for specific age ranges. But there's so many different stories that are told within that framework that are different enough to differentiate themselves and be interesting while also sort of being familiar. And that's a safe zone for a lot of people to just sort of continue engaging with these stories. So it reminds me a lot of YA because of course, there's going to be comparisons made. I already made a comparison to Harry Potter with this novel here, but everyone knows that Harry Potter was read by so and so's mom, this grandma over here, this grandpa. Everyone in the world read Harry Potter at the time, or seemingly. I guess I'm speaking from personal experience because I can remember a time being oh, I don't read YA, and kind of pushing back against it. And now I'm sort of settled into it at this point to where it doesn't engage me quite as much as it used to. But I still do enjoy these stories. I still have a fun time, especially engaging with the world that people have built. Like I said, that's one thing that really kind of latched its hooks into me in this story is I really was drawn into this world.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to lay out all that stuff, and also I'm an adult man, so in all the ways in which I am not the intended audience, and also give some insight into how I read this book, and all of that, considered. I did enjoy this book. I loved the Russian-inspired world building. It felt fresh to me. It felt, exciting. The characters were relatable. They were mostly very interesting. I liked there's some misdirects that happen. I don't want to get into spoilers. There's some misdirects in the plot that I felt like really worked.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of familiar tropes here for YA, but then also for fantasy in general.
Mm-hmm.
But there was enough of a twist to where you're able to achieve that familiar with a twist magic that a lot of people talk about in publishing, especially in genre fiction, that is often being looked for. And finding that right balance of like, I want to be familiar enough, but also have enough of a twist to stand out. And it's interesting to think about this book in those ways. I found the small science magic system surrounding the Grisha to be really intriguing. It felt, again, familiar, but a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like there's a lot of complexity beneath the surface within the magic system that we didn't necessarily get in this first book.
I felt a lot of that
I would be really interested to get more of going forward.
I felt like it was a deliberate attempt to hold back information so that we understood the powers, we understood how different factions had contained different people, and how typically they're almost seen as like royals, the people who have powers in this story. And they're like almost a different like species. They're kind of like all beautiful and all like this kind of thing, and then that's all subverted with our main character. Because I did think there was like a deliberate attempt to sort of set her up as a certain type of character and then build her up in a different way, which I did enjoy Alina's arc in this story.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of interesting stuff to get into with Alina. Her arc was interesting. Her romantic interests carried it in a lot of ways. I did, just as a point of criticism, I found her to be very passive protagonist.
Especially, which, I wanted to say that because especially early on, like the first couple chapters, I felt like the story was passing her by, and I was like, I was surprised because typically that's when you kind of relate with a character and get, brought into the world a little more.
She, throughout the plot, I would say, feels like she's kind of getting swept along. She's getting carried around by events, bouncing off of other characters who know more than her and are manipulating her in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, it feels a little bit passive. And I mention this because this is a concern that is often comes up in people's first novels, is that people tend to write more passive protagonists early on when they're just getting started writing. So
and like, to give her the benefit of the doubt, I do think there was a deliberate attempt to like have a character that is relatable to someone who's insecure or like feels like they're not fully respected for who they feel like they are inside, and like there's that, and obviously we see the arc going on and we see her develop as a character, and like there can be an argument to be said for like that was a deliberate attempt, but I agree, it did still, even through most of the novel, it did feel like decisions were being made for her.
Yeah, so there's not a lot we can really get into with specifics until we get into the spoiler section, so let's hold off. We can talk more about that when we get to that section. I do want to talk about Leigh Bardugo, the person, a little bit that I was able to find, because I think it's a really interesting story. This is a very modern author, still writing right now. She obviously debuted in 2012, so very new. Let's talk about her a little bit. Leigh Bardugo was born in Jerusalem, Israel, and grew up in Los Angeles, California, where she was raised by her grandparents. She is a non-practicing Jew and of Sephardic Jewish descent on her father's side, and Ashkenazi Jewish, which is Russian Jewish and Lithuanian Jewish descent on her mother's side. I thought that was interesting because of the Russian Jewish connection.
Yeah. I'm non-practicing 23% Ashkenazi Jewish, by the way, as well.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not know that about you. That's fascinating. Wow. What side of your family does that come from?
My mom's side.
Cool.
Yeah.
Interesting. Oh, well, you have that in common with Leigh Bardugo a little bit.
Awesome.
She attended Yale University, where she graduated a degree in English in 1997. Before publishing her first novel, she worked in copywriting and journalism, as well as makeup and special effects. Which the makeup and special effects, I think, was particularly interesting because of some of the stuff that goes on in the book, which we can get to.
Yeah.
So Bardugo's debut novel, Shadow and Bone, is the first book in the Grisha Trilogy, and it was published in 2012 by Macmillan. The novel hit number 8 on the New York Times bestseller list. The other books in the trilogy are Siege and Storm and Ruin and Rising, which were published by Macmillan in 2013 and 2014, respectively. So she had a book come out every year for those first 3 years, and she's got a bunch more come out. So she's kind of kept this pace up. She's writing a lot. The Six of Crows duology, which includes The Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom, was published by Macmillan in 2015 and 2016. So we're talking every year.
Wow.
It is set in the same universe as the Grisha Trilogy, sometimes collectively referred to as the Grishaverse, which I mentioned earlier. Bardugo then wrote the first book in the DC Icon series, which are novelizations of DC Comics' biggest superheroes. Her Wonder Woman Warbringer was published by Penguin Random House in 2017. So
awesome.
She went and wrote a Wonder Woman novel.
I didn't know that. That's so cool.
In 2019, Bardugo published her first adult novel, Ninth House, which won the 2019 Goodreads Choice Award for Best Fantasy Novel. I would be really interested to read an adult novel by her.
Yeah.
That maybe is a little more in my wheelhouse of like things that I would read for generally what I would gravitate towards for entertainment personally.
I guess just to ask you here up front while we're still in general-ish before we get into any of the other stuff, do you want to continue this? Like, is this a series that you want to? Because I wonder like how audience our audience is listening to this right now and thinking we feel about it.
Yeah. I would definitely be interested in reading more. I think this is one where I'm really excited for the adaptation because I think the adaptation is going to include a lot of information that wasn't necessarily laid out when she was writing this first book. Mm-hmm. And when you're going back and adapting something, you have the benefit of seeing everything in the universe.
Yeah.
So I think that if the adaptation is as good as I hope it is, I could see that really juicing up my excitement for the series and going into like a second season. If it seems like the events from the second season are going to line up with the events from the second book, I could definitely see myself being excited to cover that in the future.
Yeah.
Especially if people are interested.
Yeah.
Again.
Definitely, yeah. I agree. I enjoyed this. I think that should be stated like multiple times throughout because I do feel like we're going to have some criticisms here, but we're not necessarily the target demographic for this story. But I am excited for the adaptation. I absolutely will continue on if there's interest in it. Like I'm excited to see like where else the story could go.
So Shadow and Bone is her first novel. When Entertainment Weekly questioned Bardugo about her inspiration for the series, she explained, quote, "In most fantasy, darkness is metaphorical. It's just a way of talking about evil. Darkness falls across the land, a dark age is coming, etc. I wanted to take something figurative and make it literal. So the question became, what if darkness was a place? What if the monsters lurking there were real and more horrible than anything you'd ever imagined beneath your bed or behind the closet door? If you had to fight them on their own territory, blind and helpless in the dark? These ideas eventually became the Shadowfold." So we always talk about story seeds, and I found this really interesting. Mm-hmm. At the back of my book, there was a little interview that asked her just random questions about her life. And one of the questions was about the idea, where did it come from? And she mentioned a moment, I can't remember if it was at her own house or it might have been at a friend's house, where she like saw like a shadow at the end of a hallway and like was convinced there was a monster in it. Mm-hmm. And became like really terrified. And I think she specifically mentioned like a monster with teeth or something. And it gave her the idea of like a fantasy setting where there are creatures in the darkness and that you have to go there to actually fight them. Yeah.
I mean, the Shadowfold is probably the Shadowfold and the magic system and sort of the world building overall. Like if we talked about the Russian, you mentioned the Russian influence are the things that really struck me and the Shadowfold specifically, because I love that, it's not there have been similar things in other fantasy stories that I've read, but this is like, I feel like this is again a situation where I feel like we've just scraped the surface of the Shadowfold. Like there's so much more to like how did it come about? What is it? Is it a dimension that we're opening? Is it this? Is it that? Like what is the Darkfold? Is it literally just like dark magic? To be determined, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't get answers to a lot of that in this first book, but I assume it's explored more in later books. So speaking of the Russian stuff, Bardugo was inspired to model her fantasy world Ravka after the Russian Empire of the early 1800s. When asked why she chose such a peculiar setting, Bardugo explained, and this I don't know why it's peculiar. It's just a different setting, but okay. That's the thing I'm reading. She said, I think there's tremendous power in the images we associate with Russian culture and history, these extremes of beauty and brutality that lend themselves to fantasy. And honestly, as much as I love broadswords and flagons of ale, and believe me, I do, I wanted to take readers someplace a little different. Tsarist Russia gave me a different point of departure. So yeah, I think that's a great explanation for why you might do this. I think if you're an aspiring author, recognizing that there is a saturation point for the sort of Western-inspired, D&D-ish fantasy out there. Mm-hmm. And if you can take a different tact, it could be well worth it to you to do so, especially if you can tap into something from your own history. That way you can be more authentic in sort of representing it.
Yeah. As far as world history goes, like I haven't studied well enough Russian to know, I know of like certain Ivan the Terrible. I know about some of the like famous ones that you touch on.
Yeah.
But going back to like the 1800s, like the empire was so, like you see images of it and it's so striking and it's so unique to itself. You can tell right away that it's Russia in the 1800s.
Well, and elsewhere she talked about this huge dramatic difference between the palaces and how the extreme beauty and opulence as compared to the extreme poverty of the common citizen. So she found that like really, really striking and a potential for a lot of dramatic.
Well, and in her world, there's wars. Like it's just a constant world at war. It seems like so far.
Yeah. So one other thing that I found really fascinating. So Bardugo progressed through the steps of querying agents to accepting representation to being offered a 3-book deal in 37 days.
Jesus. Wow.
The Grisha series went to auction on December 1st of 2010 and was sold to Henry Holt and Macmillan on December 3rd, which is pretty incredible. Like going to auction is the dream for anybody. Selling a 3-book deal, amazing. The idea that you would be selling your book within a month of getting representation, a little over a month, it's just wild. So it's one of those things where it's like, it does still happen.
Yeah.
It's incredibly rare. So you don't want to like pin your hopes on this happening.
Right.
It's very uncommon.
Just out of curiosity, if something's going to auction like this, how polished is that version? Like you just have like your final manuscript that's gone through?
It varies.
Yeah.
So here I expect there wasn't a lot of revision after signing with the agent, merely because of the time frame we're talking about. There's no time for it. So usually when you sign with an agent, there could be some revision based off of the agent's notes. They might say like, I want to represent you. I believe in this book. However, here's some stuff I think we should do to improve it. Mm-hmm. And then you might take some time working on it before you actually go on submission. And that, I think clearly that didn't happen here. So I suspect it was close, but that does not mean that once it was acquired, it didn't go through an editorial process. It very likely did. So it's hard to know without, having Leigh Bardugo tell us what exactly may have changed from the point in which it went to auction and what we actually ended up seeing.
Interesting.
But yeah, so that's, I read that interview at the end of my books. I have like some more other random tidbits and stuff, which I'll pepper in if they become relevant. But I felt like that was enough to get a feel for her. She worked as this makeup artist, which I think is really interesting for some of the magic we see and how it works. She also noted that she like worked at a beer garden one time, and it's like a copy editor and all these different assorted jobs. And I think that's really interesting also in the sense of there's a lot of magical thinking about authors. And I feel like there's a lot of people who feel like, well, you never hear about an author being this or being that. So this must mean I'm not going to be successful if I work this job or I do this thing. But like, that is definitely not the case. Like there's all sorts of, varied backgrounds, work, like, in fact, all that stuff can bring you texture. It can become a strength for you. Mm-hmm. Like clearly she used her knowledge of makeup and special effects and all this stuff and was able to employ that in the writing in an interesting way. So yeah, don't feel bad about your random jobs and feel like that is somehow holding you back. If anything, it could be a strength. Okay, so if you're ready, I think let's get into some spoiler talk. I have a plot summary which is I've divided it into 3 chunks, and we can sort of just go through it chunk at a time and react to it.
Let's do it. I have a lot to say.
So Alina Starkov is a teenage girl who grew up with Malyan Oretsev at an orphanage in Karimzin in the Kingdom of Ravka. The story begins as they march through the Unsea, also called the Fold, a perpetually dark, barren strip of land cutting most of Ravka off from the sea. Periodic expeditions sent across the sea to transport goods and bring back imports are often plagued by monsters called the Volcra that inhabit the Unsea. During their crossing, the Volcra attack, and while saving Mal, Alina displays an extraordinary Grisha talent. The Grisha are people with the ability to manipulate the elements to use as a weapon, to call fire, to summon wind, to stop hearts. Alina can summon light. The leader of the Grisha, the Darkling, rushes Alina to the capital Osalta, saying her power is unique and valuable, which makes her an assassination target by the enemies of Ravka. Okay, so that's the opening to the book.
Mm-hmm.
What were your thoughts on this first part and the introduction of the characters?
Yeah, like all the way back to the beginning, the orphanage.
Yeah.
I think giving having these two characters connected in that way, they're the only people who care about each other in this whole world, is a good setup, and it has a lot of drama built up in it because that's such an intense relationship there. And then, right away we know that she is like interested in him. They grow. So we go from the orphanage and we get this scene where they're...
It's interesting because it's an orphanage, but it's also like the Duke's house, right?
Yes.
So I guess the Duke brings in orphans.
Yes.
To their house, I guess.
And then so Grisha are there for some reason, and that's our introduction to Grisha, and we get a little bit of explanation there.
Yeah, they do. There's some sort of testing that goes on for children who demonstrate some sort of affinity for this magic. So present early on, I really liked the idea of these two, Mal and Alina, sort of sneaking around, hiding in cupboards. They form this bond with each other, and it's clear that they're going to be like lifelong friends because of this, and kind of, there's going to be an attraction there when they get older. I was assuming that was going to happen because they're not related. They were brought in at different times. You know what I mean? So she's not, even though he's like a brother to her, he is not a brother. This is also, they are orphans, and she is sort of the chosen one. So these are two big tropes in fantasy, and they're present here. So like I was saying before, like there are a lot of tropes, and like I think new authors lean into tropes more because they are familiar with them, they love them, and it's kind of an easy touchstone.
It's a jumping off point
when you're plotting.
too.
Yeah. Now, that's not to say she doesn't do enough here to make it different, and I think she does, right? But I do think that if you're someone who reads a lot of this kind of stuff, and that kind of becomes that's the point of where you might lose some people, is if people read a lot of YA, read a lot of fantasy, they can see a couple of orphans with a chosen one and roll their eyes and say, I've seen this too many times. I want to read something more different than that. Now, yes, maybe the Russian stuff is enough to hold them in the world because that's different, but that's going to vary from reader to reader. And I just found myself wondering how many people who otherwise might enjoy the series if they keep going on find this to be kind of a stumbling block early. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's gonna hit each person differently. It's if you're willing, because like going into the story knowing it was YA, I think I was ready to cut slack and like give the benefit of the doubt for like certain tropes. Like I knew that we were gonna see some tropes, and partially because like I sort of knew the premise of the story. Like I had read like a little like back of the book kind of summary kind of thing of it. So I was like, okay, so it's gonna be a pretty familiar sort of story, but I was happy to see that it was a female protagonist, because historically I think maybe more recently it's become more normal, but that historically it wasn't the case. So just shout out to having a female protagonist that was in this case the chosen one. Like I think typically it's a male character.
Yes, that's true. Farm boy, chosen one, farm boy trope. That's accurate. I would say that YA is kind of dominated by women authors right now. There is a lot. There is, like you said, recently that has changed, at least within this category. You look at something like The Hunger Games, you look at Twilight, there are a lot of these YA franchises with a woman protagonist as a young girl protagonist as the main character. And we're getting that here. I kept thinking of The Hunger Games, which is like one of the few novels in this category that I have read. I have not read Twilight. I have not read some others, in this. There's probably a few that are slipping my mind that I've read, but I particularly kept thinking of Hunger Games because of what we get into a little bit, which I guess we can touch on here, because we get introduced to the Darkling through this. Well, before we get to the Darkling, let's focus on Mal a little bit more, because we get after the opening, there's kind of a prologue, which I thought was interesting, because prologues are another thing that are a big hot button issue, which I could talk about for a long time. There's but
are you
there is a prologue
for or against? Are you?
I like them.
Yeah.
And the thing is, as with all things, it has to be done well, and it has to be done for a reason. I like the idea of the prologue and epilogue here are called before and after in the book. They serve as bookends for the story. They, I sometimes like a ramping up and a ramping down, a little bit of hey, we're about to get into the story proper, but I want to I have this important bit of information that occurs before that I want to show you. It's important, so don't get me wrong, but it's set up as sort of a appetizer to the main course. Now, some people don't like that at all. Many agents out there will balk at the idea of it. Now, I think partially this is because agents only get, often when they're first getting a sample, your first 5 or 10 pages. And the first 5 or 10 pages, if you write a prologue, you're sending in a prologue. And they probably read a lot of prologues and then have to try and extrapolate out to what the rest of the book is going to be like. And it's frustrating because it's this isn't really what the book's going to be like. This is a prologue.
I can see that.
So I think that's affecting it a little bit. I don't know how many of them realize that, but that's different than most readers who don't view prologues the same way.
I do. Yeah, I agree. I don't push back against prologues, but I typically like a prologue that's if it's going to be something, give us flavor for the world that's ancient. You know what I mean? Something that's happened a long time ago that then we get to, it's so separated from the main story that it's sort of just giving context and background a little bit. And then we jump into the story. Cause in this case,
you like that or you don't like that?
I do like that.
Interesting.
Yeah. Cause I typically don't I would prefer, I think most of the time, to jump straight into the story if the prologue has to do with our characters pretty directly. If it's, I don't know. I guess it's just a preference because it gives it an epic feel when it's something that's ancient magical history or something that's setting up a story that you then live in. But
what's funny is that kind of prologue is, I think, the most hated kind. I think people really don't like that. If it's something that is ancient and disconnected from our main characters in a lot of ways, a lot of people go, just cut this.
I like that. Yeah, I know. I like it.
So that's funny. I mean, and that's an interesting data point because once again, readers are sometimes different than industry people, right? And people would counter that you only have on average a page or 5 pages to hook a reader before they'll decide whether or not they want to read it.
Yeah.
And do you want to lead off with your ancient backstory stuff?
Yeah.
It's tough. It's also a kind of thing that when you're more established in your career and you have a devoted readership, I feel you can get away with a little bit more. It's often if it's your debut, people are well, don't do it in your debut. So there's a lot of weird rules about debuts here that we can touch on throughout. But anyway, that's all beside the point. Of there is a prologue here. We go forward in time, and we see Alina as this cartographer working on the front near the Shadowfold. Mal is this tracker now. He's got these kind of bro-ish friends that he hangs out with, and we see them sort of interacting in a way that I think it's very clear that she is attracted to him, but she is afraid to say anything. She doesn't want to reveal her feelings because she doesn't think that he feels the same way about her. She sees him as someone who has a lot of attention from women, and whether or not it's accurate, she sees him as being okay with that and maybe even flirtatious with a lot of them. And because of that, she sees it as a indication that he's not actually into her. I do think we get some implications that maybe she's like reading into stuff too much and that it's not actually going down that way. But
yeah, I have two things here. So eventually we do kind of find out that he was like, he kind of like, this is much later, but he apologizes for not like seeing her for who she is and everything later on. But with her character, something that's like kind of frustrating, but also goes into the whole arc, if you want to give the benefit of the doubt of our main character, Alina, is she's like a cartographer, right? She's like well qualified to do it. I think they say that she's pretty good at it. And then but she's just so down on herself. Like she doesn't believe in herself in any way.
She doesn't think she's attractive.
Exactly. And
she doesn't think she's capable or brave.
And then it's almost like as we see like her power develop, she gets some more confidence. But there's also something interesting wrapped up in the fact that like she's kind of suppressing her powers, we come to find out, which we can touch on.
That's revealed later.
Yeah. In essence, like maybe she was so down on herself due to the fact that she was suppressing all of this stuff with herself so she could stay with Mal. That's kind of how it's explained eventually. But it makes for a less interesting protagonist to go along with when they're this sort of like wishy-washy.
Yeah, it can. And again, she's a very passive character. In this sense too, because she isn't very self-assured, she isn't very confident, and so because of that she tends to be more passive. But let's talk a little bit about Mal, the sort of first romantic lead that we see, the main romantic lead. I thought he was giving off himbo energy at the start of this book.
Okay.
I thought he was going to be more like that throughout, but I do think later on in the book, after he's like lived more of his life and gone through some shit, he changes a little bit. He seems a little more self-aware and a little more emotionally like connected and aware of like the effect he has maybe on women. I don't know. But early on I was getting like oh, I'm so good looking, women all like me. I'm a little bit oblivious to it. I'm oblivious to this to this woman Alina who's clearly into me, and I just can't like I don't know. I was getting like maybe he's not super clever early on vibes, but he's just this like hot guy. But I think he grows past that, but that was my first impression with the character.
I agree. Yeah. Again, I don't think it was the most compelling sort of will they, won't they to start it off. I think that the characters get a lot more interesting after post powers. Like I think so he's of course like a hunter,
Tracker.
well established, like capable type person, and then we get into a battle, which we just talked about, where there's like fucking crazy creatures with gnashing mouths that are like gonna tear him apart, and then she jumps in and saves him. And then I think that's like a humbling experience for him there, and then I think like that mixed with the fact that he like couldn't protect her and all that stuff maybe changes his perspective as we go on.
Well, and metaphorically, right, like it's interesting she talks about the literal darkness and making things literal, but I think metaphorically the idea of her inner light being her strength that is sort of secret and has been suppressed, I think is interesting, right? Like, so her inner light is what saves him and what reveals that she is the sun summoner to the Darkling, who we got to talk about.
So we talked about how she's the chosen one, right? I thought there was an interesting like slight subversion with the chosen one trope, because typically the chosen one is just like all powerful. And like they're just like gonna figure it out by sheer force of will.
There's always a training sequence.
Right.
I feel like there's almost always a learning to use the powers section of these books and these stories. So.
Right, but I guess what I'm saying is she, her power specifically, like because of the element, is why I think she's powerful in the story, and then eventually the antler stuff that we'll get into. But she's not necessarily like immediately just overpowered because she's like the one chosen one who can do this. At least as far as I can tell, it seems like it just so happens that darkness is what is in this realm, and what's the opposite of darkness is light, and that's what her power ended up being. So it's like almost like a type advantage versus like you're the chosen ultimate master of all magic.
I see what you're saying. But then there's also only one.
Right.
So I think it's interesting. Like she is not a sun summoner. There's been many. She's this one, and she's sort of like the person who's supposed to save the realm from the Shadowfold and all this stuff. So in that sense, it does feel very chosen one to me. But let's talk about, first off, the Grisha, which I've heard her say that she felt like sort of by sound evokes geisha, which that's interesting, right? Like, and she said that she likes that it evokes a sense of like beauty and etherealness and power. So I like knowing that, because it shows me how she views these these characters, and they're sort of said to be sort of like otherworldly in their looks and appearance. That like clearly their magic, it seems to extend their lives sometimes or make them seem younger than they are. And the Grisha are all surrounding the Darkling, who is sort of like the most powerful among them, and he is who identifies like and has her brought before him so that he can figure out what's going on with her. He ends up like scratching her, cutting her, and her makes her light like come out, and prove that she is this sun summoner character who he is interested in. And he is described as this like he wears a lot of black. He's dark and mysterious. He's handsome. He's kind of an unknown age, but around her age, a little bit older. I was getting like kind of vampiric vibes from him. I don't know about you, like especially after reading Interview with a Vampire and some other vampire stuff we've gone into. I was like getting some of that kind of vibes.
I mean, as soon as you have a character who's older than they look, and they like you said, have a lot of like dark, mysterious stuff going on, you're gonna get that in your story.
Yeah, and traditionally those characters have been sex symbols, and people love reading about them. So you're kind of getting a little bit of that when you have a character like this. And immediately I was like, okay, we're setting up a love triangle, right? Because there's sort of an attraction between the two of them. She's afraid of him, but intrigued.
Yeah,
right?
I didn't get that right away. Like I actually didn't see the whole love triangle situation happen. I didn't know that he was going to be attracted to her and like her until basically he kissed her or whatever. I was like, what the fuck?
Well. Okay, so I caught on to it when they first sat around the fire at the barn a little bit later, and they have this heart-to-heart. That's where I started feeling the attraction. Like, in their very first meeting, he's a lot more adversarial. But yeah, like, that was where I started saying, like, oh, we're going to talk about his backstory, we're going to humanize him, we're going to talk about him, how she has this, like, kind of strange, affinity for him, and they're sort of set up as, like, we're just two characters who understand each other because we have these powers that other people don't have, and, I thought that was cleverly set up, and that's where I was like, okay, we're going to get him as another romantic lead, and we're going to have this love triangle eventually develop throughout the book.
Yeah.
It's kind of what I started to expect to happen. So let's get into the middle section here, and then we can talk more. So Alina struggles to fit in with the other Grisha and to have confidence in her own abilities as she begins rigorous training. She feels a strong attraction to the Darkling, which he seems to reciprocate. During 2 encounters, they kiss, and Alina is confused by her reactions to the kisses. After demonstrating her power to the king and his court, Alina is told by her tutor, Bagra, that she must flee, that the Darkling is using her, that the Darkling created the Unsea, and that he intends to enslave her and use her Grisha power to conquer the world. Bagra also reveals that she is the Darkling's mother. 2 weeks into her flight, she is nearly captured, but is saved by Mal, who has nearly a supernatural ability to track and was sent to find her. Instead of turning her in, he helps her escape. Okay, so that's that's a lot of the novel we just covered there. But let's back up and talk about her first arriving at the palace, and the introduction to the Grisha and like the magic systems and everything that we get here, and in more of an introduction, I guess. Yeah,
it's like the magical school that we're getting here. I definitely got those sort of vibes.
She has several instructors who are like old crotchety, tough love types.
I'm a sucker for those characters too, because they're always fun. They're always like antagonistic, but also like, well, they can be antagonistic. There's usually one who's like kind of nice, like more nice than they should be. And then there's one that's like a hard ass who's like pushing you. But turns out they have like a heart of gold, or at least like they have like better intentions than you would think.
Bagra here. Yeah.
And,
heart of gold.
Yeah, I always find that to be interesting. Characters find themselves with those characters. I liked some of the training stuff. The thing that I realized here, though, was I wanted to get a little more... I almost felt like more time could have been spent here fleshing out some of the training, because it felt like the training were... I don't know. I guess it just felt like it was going by a little fast, if that makes sense. Like, I felt like they would... It felt like we only got like 3 or 4 scenes of her actually training, and then like a couple, and then some time, like significant time would pass, and then we would get another one. She'd be better, and significant time would pass when she'd be better.
I agree, because there was a lot of her learning to like fight absent her magic, which is cool. And then all of her magic training seemed to be with Bagra, who it was mostly about getting her to be able to control her own sun summoning. What I didn't feel like we were getting a lot of was a description of the small science, which is the magic system, and like how exactly it works. We get a little bit of that, but like through her actually learning the art and like learning to perform it, it just felt like there should have been more of that sort of instruction to make her feel like she fully understands the system of magic. Instead, it felt very focused on just her trying to get control of her sun summoning.
Yeah. And there were scenes, obviously, where she would have conversations with other summoners and other classmates, or I don't even know if they call them classmates necessarily, but other people in this area. And I kind of was looking for more scenes outside of the training as well, like some more scenes of maybe like hijinks or something going on that they're getting up to besides their day-to-day and then the conversations they have between the training sessions.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about some of the other stuff going on. We meet the royal family, which there is this creepy figure who is looming in the background. He's this apparat, and I mean, he's Rasputin. Do you know anything about Rasputin?
A little
this
bit,
guy's
yeah.
Rasputin.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, okay, so this is a Rasputin character. And I was amazed at just how much he evokes Rasputin to me. But I realized that he's not maybe super well known in pop culture.
Yeah, I guess
so
I don't know enough
don't.
about him to like, I guess I just thought that he was just a mysterious dude and that was similar.
Oh, he was like this spiritual grifter type who got like welcomed into the royal family and just like fucked everything up and was manipulative and had like, anyway, there's a lot that goes on with him. So I'm really interested to see how much of that she leans into in future books, if we actually get any of it, or if she ends up going away from it. But I was like, wow, she's really setting him up.
Yeah, I definitely felt like this was a character that didn't have a lot to do in the story, but there was significant time spent like talking about this character, at least that the character lurking.
Yeah. And then even his physical description, he has this beard. He's known for he kind of smells bad. He has these yellow teeth. And like Rasputin was known for being like, he was very big and bearded and sort of like feral seeming. So I thought she was evoking some similar stuff with him. And then you also have this like kind of repulsive king. And we get the implication that maybe he has like sexually assaulted some people and he's this creep. And the royal family in general just seems like a bunch of bad people. This queen who like seems like very, I don't know, out of touch and obsessed with physical appearance. And then that gives me the light though, because I want to talk about the physical appearance stuff. There is a lot of discussions of the main character's looks, how she perceives herself, and then the use of magic through this character Genya, who is assigned to like make her look presentable for the court. And it's sort of set up as like here in the court, everybody expects you to look a certain way, so we're gonna sort of like bring you up to this standard, so that you fit in, I guess. And then Genya uses her magic. It's kind of like a magical makeover. She gets a magical makeover. That's what happens.
And Genya also like has been like, I think the Darkling like forced her into that role too. Like that's not like a desirable role within these Grisha. Yeah,
although she is kind of known for being particularly good at it, I think. Like it's a skill of hers.
Yeah.
So because of that, I wanted to talk about this because my wife also read this book while I was reading this. And she talked to me a little bit about how, like, a lot of the stuff we've talked about, she really loved the world. She thought the magic system was really interesting. But one of her stumbling blocks was a lot of this stuff caught up in physical appearance and how important it seemed to be and how much focus there was on, like, needing to look beautiful in order to be powerful. And, like, it's complicated. I won't speak for her anymore about that. But for me, I definitely was picking up on it was like she wanted to have a reason to say you have to do this because of the setting and stuff, and there's a little bit of pushback from Alina. She's like, I'm happy with the way I look, but then we quickly get into like how much she's enjoying it, how much she feels more powerful. And as someone who was a makeup artist for Leigh Bardugo, was a makeup artist, I can see the influence of that, like feeling like you're bringing out people's best features and you're sort of highlighting that. But there's also some like complicated messaging going on here, especially for young girls who might be reading this, or any young people who might be reading it and feeling like they aren't happy with their appearance. and feeling like they need to do something to make themselves look more beautiful in order to be more powerful.
Yeah. I mean, just to touch on that too,
yeah.
I was kind of surprised the first time it was mentioned that like all the people who have this magic, all the Grisha, are all really good looking. And I was like, oh, interesting. So we're going to make all the really good looking people have powers. And like, what is that saying about, you know, just, I don't know, norms, like what people, you know, will walk away having, like kids specifically. If like some young adults or anybody was reading this and then they walked away thinking like, you know, the good looking people have powers.
Well, and also, and this is something that I know Leigh Bardugo has talked about with the adaptation, and she considers it something that she is glad they are fixing, is there is a complete lack of diversity in these characters. They're, I think, all described as being white. The features that are described as being beautiful are often blonde hair, blue eyes, red hair, green eyes, like very sort of almost Aryan appearances. And Leigh Bardugo has talked about how she regrets that about this early book. And she thought that as she went over time in her novel, she started to include a more diverse cast that represents or reflects the world around her and the people she knows more accurately. And she's really glad that the show has a very diverse cast.
Cool.
And so that is something I'm excited to see.
Yeah, I think that's awesome that like as time went on, she continued to like try to do better, you know, to realize what you did.
We touched on how there is some potentially troubling messaging here, but it becomes even worse when you tie it to the fact that it seems to be implied that you also have to be white in order to be this kind of beautiful. And so that's obviously upsetting. So, you know, we're not the right people maybe to speak on this more than we are here, but it is something I picked up on. And I don't know. I can also appreciate the idea of a magical makeover just being sort of fun, like stop overanalyzing it. You know, she talks about how it's like highlighting her best features. Like we all would like to do that, right? Like everything we do is about highlighting the best features that we want to show to people, right? Like everything we do, from our haircuts to the way we style our, you know, what we wear. We do this all the time. So it's kind of an extension of that just with magic. And so in that sense, it's cool, but I just think it's worth noting that it can turn some people off, especially if they are someone who feels like they never fit the mold of beauty that is being held up here as like what should be sought after.
Yeah, I agree.
But beyond that, let's talk about the reveal of the Darkling.
Let's do it.
Because the Darkling, they get to the point where they like make out and they have this like passionate kiss after this performance that is put on in the palace.
They basically almost have sex also. Like,
they almost have sex,
which is
like
interrupted.
Yeah,
which is another thing that I was picking up on is like sexual tension, like just like the things that are going on in your life at that age and like what you're thinking about at that age. Like that
for sure
definitely struck me as something like it felt like it's so much more passionate. It feels like it's so intense. I think for those reasons.
The intensity of the romance is amped up, and there's a space left in her life by the fact that at this time she's been writing to Mal and not hearing back from him, and she's starting to go like, well, everything I thought was true about us is maybe over, like maybe that was a time in my life and now I've moved on. He's moved on from me, clearly he's not responding to my letters. And we kind of know that this is probably inaccurate, but she's caught up in it, and it leaves space, I think, for the Darkling to move in as a potential romantic interest, and it creates like an interesting dynamic if you start going like, well, is she right? Should she be holding out? Is she right to be mad about Mal? And then also, it's tied to her magic, right? Like as you mentioned before, it's revealed that when she originally got the test, and the reason this didn't come up is she was suppressing it because she knew basically that Mal wasn't going to pass the test. He didn't have the magic, and she didn't want to be separated from him, essentially. So she wanted to like suppress it and hide it. So in a sense, she was like suppressing herself for his benefit, and she learns to change the way she views that and actually just do things for herself and not for him.
Yeah.
And there's sort of an empowering moment there as she realizes that, which I think is good for her as a character.
Yeah. I think the she's also suppressing to the point that she doesn't remember this stuff, like when she got the test, like because she goes around, like it's not like she's under the impression that she has powers and she's suppressing them because it's a first person novel, like it's from Alina's point of view for the most part,
right?
And
no, it is.
She it's not like she's like, oh, but I have a dark secret. It's literally just like, I'm not a Grisha the whole time. And then we get the reveal that she like unlocks this memory where she was like, oh shit, I've been suppressing it this whole time. And that kind of explains why things are happening the way that they are.
So we're about to get into where this book shifts gears, and for me, this is what elevated this book from what I would consider an okay entry. Like it has things going for it, and it has some stuff I like, and overall, I was going to come away from going, yeah, that was okay. Mm-hmm. And it instead shifted gears when the Darkling is revealed to actually be manipulating her, lying to her, knows full well that what he's doing, and she is actually being groomed to be a tool for him to use, a weapon, and he is deliberately romantically manipulating her, in a very dark way, honestly. And I thought all of that was like a really cool kind of like earth-shattering revelation. There was hints of it happening throughout, but I read this book very quickly, so because of that, I didn't have a lot of time to like ruminate about what could be happening. So maybe because of that, I didn't see it coming.
I agree.
And so I was surprised by it.
Yeah, I was the same way. Like I was going through it at such a pace. I think one of the major reveals too was that he's not just a Darkling; he's the Darkling that created the Shadowfold. And that was a big reveal for me, and it was like, oh shit. So he's like a super creep because he's like, he lied and said he was like 100 years old or whatever, but come to find out he's like super old.
Way older than that.
Older than that. He's been manipulating this teenage or like young adult girl into like all of these romantic situations, and then like it's all been for power ultimately. Yeah, it was a good reveal, and I definitely agree. I didn't see it coming in the ways that I probably should have if I was thinking about it, but it made for an effective, like you said, hook. Like that was like a big reveal, and then that's to also explain how powerful this person is, because if he's just a Darkling, it's different from being the original Darkling that created the fold.
Yeah,
because they talked about how difficult that would have been and how powerful that person was, and then you're like, oh shit, she's like in confrontation with this ancient, older, very powerful entity.
He was called the Black Heretic. That was who was said to initially have opened the Shadowfold, and it's revealed that he is one and the same as the Black Heretic through Baghra. So as the reveal goes, I did think it wasn't quite what I wanted it to be, in the sense that it was Baghra essentially just telling her, this is what the effects of what's been going on. And then I think there was some sort of like magical showing a little bit of like, look at this, and this is proof of it. But what I would have liked to see a little more of is like, I would have liked to see a little more of her not just believing another person who's telling her something, because ultimately we don't know. There wasn't a lot of, in my opinion, compelling proof provided by Baghra.
It was just that Baghra showed that she also had dark powers, and then was like, and that's my son.
Yeah, but like, she just believed her. So again, it could be like this character could be lying to you. So I would have liked to see her push back a little bit in the sense of like, I need to have proof, and then sought some sort of proof. I don't know what that would have looked like, but so that was a kind of a missed opportunity for her to like show some agency, and also do it in a way that like maybe she is, it turns out that Baghra is completely right, but not just take the first person to tell you this thing and go like, oh, okay, that makes sense, and then I'm going to flee now. But regardless, I did think that this was where the change happened in the book, where I felt like really hooked to it. And I like from here to the end, I just kind of powered through because I was like very interested in what was going to happen next. And then we get the reuniting of her and Mal. There's an interesting sort of tension now, because of course, like the first time she sees them is like right after she kissed the Darkling. And before the reveal, actually, so she's like kissed the Darkling, but before they're revealed about the Black Heretic stuff, she sees him again, and they have kind of a fight about it. So there's a lot of this like delicious drama, right, of being drummed up. It's like both characters clearly love each other, but they, there's this other thing going on. It's good. Yeah,
and there's also this whole ownership thing going on where like the Darkling has given her his sigil in his clothing, and that's like a sign of that he owns her, or he's like she's there with him kind of thing. And then that Mal sees her in that and like kind of calls her out for it and is like, he owns you at this point. And this whole ownership thing carries through with some stuff that happens in the next section, but pretty fucking dark stuff when you think about it like that. And I didn't love, we'll get to that section in a second. I didn't love that she had to become like basically a puppet, but we'll talk about it.
Yeah. So, Mal has been tasked, we find out, with finding this stag, this magical stag that is going to act as an amplifier for her magic. And also we find out in the reveal, not just an amplifier, but also like a means of control the Darkling will have, where he will be able to control her power through her. And because Mal is this like incredible tracker, he was sent to track down this thing. So because of that, he has intimate knowledge of where it is. They decide to hunt a magic stag in the far north. If Alina kills the stag and makes a necklace of its antlers, her powers will be greatly amplified. After much time and effort, they find the stag, just as they realize how much Alina and Mal love each other. She refuses to kill the stag, and the stag acknowledges this. At that moment, the Darkling and his minions appear. The Darkling kills the stag and forces the antler necklace on Alina, making her his absolute slave, unable to disobey him in the slightest. They quickly return south to the major crossing point of the Unsea. The Darkling forces Alina to protect the ship during the crossing. Near the other side, the Darkling extends the Unsea, causing great death and destruction. He then throws Mal off the ship onto the Unsea to be devoured by monsters. In desperation, Alina finally realizes that her act of mercy, sparing the stag, gives her the possibility to break free of the Darkling's enslavement. Her love of Mal grants her the strength she needs. Alina breaks free, leaps out of the ship, saves Mal, and destroys the ship. The book ends with Mal and Alina taking passage across the true sea, escaping from Ravka and the Darkling. So, let's back up. Going to find the magic stag, and this sort of, there's like a road trip together where their romance, I think, finally starts to blossom, like, for real.
I like the scenes that they have together, because I did feel like it was a chance for them to slow down and get some character moments together, and like you sort of can fully buy into their romance at that point. There's apologies given kind of by Mal, and he's talking about how, what I said before, he didn't really see her. He was sort of overlooking her in his life, and then ultimately builds to them like kissing, and then at that moment the stag shows up, and then the moment of mercy, and then the killing by the Darkling.
Yeah, which was a surprise. I liked the idea of her deciding not to kill the stag, and then he comes in and kills it. And then he seems to show up kind of at magical times. This is like it's happened a couple times in the book, but I guess he'd been tracking them and just was like biding his time to pop up. We don't know how, but maybe we'll learn later how he's able to do that. But there's a lot of compulsion and control going on in this book, and there's definitely some like squicky stuff going on there with that. But it's also her fighting against that and like learning that her own inner strength is enough to like overcome it, and then also her act of mercy gave her a deeper connection with this amplifier stag, to where she actually has control over it in a way that she didn't realize. And I liked kind of the themes and the lessons being imparted there. I thought were all good.
I definitely agree. That was something that I felt was strong. It didn't feel like it was just like a last second reveal where it was like, oh yeah, and by the way, secret power. It was something that was earned, so I appreciated it.
Yeah. One other thing I maybe didn't touch on enough, I thought this book was pretty funny at times. I thought there was some nice quippy dialogue. One that particularly made me like kind of laugh out loud was when she has this moment where she's like, Mal, if I get taken by the Darkling, you have to kill me. Like, promise you'll kill me. And she convinces him to promise. And this is stuff we've seen in other media, right? What I thought was really funny was when he brings it up later, he's like, yeah, and then, I'll cut your head off. And she's like, I didn't say cut my head off. Jesus. I was thinking like a poisoning or something. It was violent.
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty funny, right? Like the cut your head off quip I thought was good. And throughout there was like some nice like back and forth she would have with characters like that it felt kind of modern and fun, even though it was in this other setting, which I liked.
Yeah, I agree. I like that too.
So yeah, then we get this final trip across the unsea. We get this sort of tunnel of light, and then she sort of realized her actual control, reasserts herself, and she then saves Mao. Yeah, they're able to escape the Darkling. He's trying to put on this big show for these other like emissaries from other realms, like,
and he kind of succeeds too, right? Like there's a moment
demonstrating his power.
Yeah, there's a moment of like defeat also within this, where it's like I'm sure that's gonna have like ramifications going forward, but he like uses her initially when they're on the ship, when they get out to the Shadowfold. He uses the power of her to then use his own magic to amplify the darkness, sends it even further, and like basically like takes over another like town or whatever, another colony nearby, and then like they just watch all these people get killed
within the Ravka.
Yeah,
it's like his own people.
Yeah.
So he's set up as this madman.
Exactly, and then he's telling all these emissaries and stuff, like you were saying. He's like, I'm gonna make things better. I'm gonna end all these wars, whether it, killing whoever I have to along the way. So I'm gonna become the tyrant here.
Well, and there's another part of the reveal that said that the Volcra are twisted former people who were like caught up in the shadow, and so he's behind all of this, right? Like he's killed thousands of people, or more, and he controls it all, and he's sort of the Dark Lord at this point, right? Like he's Sauron, but in this lovable guise for a while. So I think it's a really interesting character, right? And I'm sure he continues to be fascinating throughout, because he's definitely not dead at the end of this.
Yeah,
we could safely
the
say
twisted people thing was pretty creepy, and it worked for me. They're like screaming basically, like when the like the light blasts on them and stuff. And I also like the description of like when they're revealed in the light, like what they look like, and how different that like it's described as like this area that hasn't been lit up in forever, and so just for the light to come in and reveal all this that hasn't been shown for such a long time. I liked a lot of that stuff. And there's also that last chapter that I liked. It's sort of like
it's the epilogue.
It's the epilogue.
Is that what you're talking about? Yeah.
It's like a little it felt like a teaser for more stories, while also wrapping it up nicely and kind of making it feel like mythical, and like it's like this story that's being told where it's like, and then the two orphans, they got back together and they're lonely in the world again, but that's just right by them, because that's how they started together and alone, and not knowing what's ahead of them and that kind of thing. So it's like this full circle moment.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that's the end of the book. I like the way it wraps. It does feel like there's a lot more story to tell. I think you can clearly tell this is the start of a series. But it wraps enough, right? Like it's always difficult to find that balance of like wrapping things up enough to where if no other book was ever published, you'd feel like you had, justification for like ending the book where it ended, but also leaving the door open for future books. And so in that sense, this book really does it. One other thing that I just had to mention is just like, this is a problem with first time novels and people, like, again, like my experience reading other manuscripts, ending chapters with characters falling asleep or being unconscious is like it's like this unconscious thing that people do when they're writing, where they're like, well, I don't really know how to end this, so I'll have them go to bed.
It reminded me
I don't really know how to end this, I'll get them knocked out. That happens a lot in this book. I want to say a third of all chapters end with her going to sleep or being unconscious.
I mean, it reminds me of our last project in Sleepy Hollow, Tim Burton's Sleepy Hollow. Johnny Depp is just like constantly falling asleep or getting knocked out, and that's how you end the scene, and then he wakes up in a bed somewhere.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I mean, it within writing, especially ending chapters that way, I think a lot of people like it's kind of like having a character wake up at the start. Like that's another big red flag. If someone is reading your opening pages and it begins with the character waking up, It's kind of like, okay, maybe don't begin there, and don't end with someone going to sleep. Of course, you can do it, and sometimes that's a natural place for a chapter to end. But there is something to be said for maybe doing it a bit much, and I felt like that happened here in this book. So that it just comes back to my overall takeaways. So let's talk about like overall takeaways from this book. And for me, it was a strong world building, interesting magic, and honest, sort of like relatable emotional stakes can carry a book that might suffer from other issues. Ultimately, those things are more important. And I think it nails the really important things, or at least does them well enough.
Yeah.
And what I expect is that a lot of the issues that I was sort of encountering in this book go away or are much smaller as you progress through the series.
Yeah.
That would be my guess. And much like you said, Philosopher's Stone to the rest of Harry Potter, it's just tip of the iceberg. You're barely getting anything of what's going on in this world. And I'm sure that's the case here. Like if you're someone who's read all these other Grisha novels, you're probably screaming about all the things that change as it goes on and get better and I fully understand that, and so for me it was like this was pretty good. It went from being okay to pretty good with the shifting of the gear. It was a pretty good book. Ultimately, I'm definitely happy that I read it. I'm really interested to go into the adaptation now with this under my belt.
Yeah. I mean, I have very similar takeaways. A lot of the things that I liked, you just touched on. So I'll just say, like, I'm excited to go into this adaptation. I think this is a world that has a lot of potential. I think we saw some of it here. And I also wanted to agree with, like, I think Bardugo, like, consciously made the effort and made the decision to lean into some of these, like, YA tropes for a reason. Like, I don't think that I don't think that's an accident. I don't think that it's just like, to create something like this, you're not doing it by accident. And so, like, deliberate choices were made to be like, I'm going to pull from this and I'm influenced by this. I like this. I don't like that. And sort of craft her own version of the story. And I'm really excited to see more in the series. And like I said, I'd be willing to and interested in going forward in the series as well.
Yeah. And we should also say here that I don't know how much of the series is what is actually going to be covered in season 1. We could very well get like all of book 2. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like I'm going to be really interested going in of like how, like, could this book could be in the first 4 episodes or something. I could totally see that happening. And maybe it does take the whole season. One thing that could be interesting is bringing in knowledge from future books and like developing the world with more texture than we necessarily got here, because this is a quick, like, I imagine this book is probably like 50 to 60,000 words. It's fast. Like, we don't get a lot of in-depth description of much at all. So when you're putting something on screen, there might be a lot more world building that goes on. Yep. I think there are characters I've seen listed that I don't recognize. So I think there are maybe whole plot lines and characters pulled from other books as well. So there's a lot to be excited about as someone who hasn't read future books going like, what are we going to get here? I don't know. I'm pumped for it.
I am too. Yeah. I did read that within this Grishaverse, like, there's this trilogy and then there's like other like trilogies and a couple of novels here and there that aren't necessarily with these characters that are within the world. Right. So I assume that's all being threaded into this series. If I mean, I guess
in some way,
that's what I assume.
I would guess so. But yeah, this was fun. We will be tackling the first 4 episodes of the Netflix series next week, which I think that series comes out on like Friday or something, right?
Very soon, yeah.
Very cool. We'll do the first 4 and then we'll come back, do the final 4 and wrap our thoughts on the show. Thank you for joining us with this. If you enjoyed this episode, a great way to let us know is to leave a rating and review on whatever app you used. Or, I wanted to say there's a Podchaser thing going on right now where if you leave a review on Podchaser, they donate like 25 cents to it's like a hunger, combating hunger organization, donating food essentially. And if you do that, we can respond to you on Podchaser, and then they'll donate another 25 cents. For every time you do that, essentially 50 cents gets donated, right? So yeah, if you leave us a review on there, it's also giving money to people who are hungry, which is great.
Yeah, that's awesome. Also, connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink to Film.
And if you wanted to support the podcast monetarily, we have a Patreon where we release bonus content on there monthly. We'll be doing another one here soon. I'm not sure exactly what it's going to be, but it will be coming out in the next week and a half or so. We would love to have you on there. There's lots of cool stuff available, merch, all kinds of things. So check that out if it interests you. Patreon.com/inktofilm.
And thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, that is going to be it for this week. I had a lot of fun with my first foray into the Grishaverse. And until next time,
thanks for listening.